We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, taxes. But I am very pleased to have Mike Owen here, who is by far one of the smartest people I know, and can talk about this, I think, all day long. So, but at least for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Mike Owen.
Thank you, Connie. Well, thank you all for coming. I guess that was maybe an April Fool's joke. That's everybody's favorite topic. It's my favorite topic. So we have a project going on at the Iowa Policy Project we call our Roadmap for Opportunity. And the idea is that if you were to set out to put Iowa on a better track to prosperity for all families, there are several issues you would have to hit. You create this roadmap effectively. And inevitably, one of the places you have to start is with tax policy. We're going to get into a little bit of that. It works out well for this. So what is opportunity? You hear a lot about it. These are dictionary definitions. Favorable juncture of circumstances, good chance for progress. We say is how do you make public policy fit in increasing opportunity for all Iowans? And one of these places is tax reform, which is connected to all of these different pins you'd place on that map and many others. Diverse group in this room, diverse interests. You could fill in the blanks with your own on that. So let's look at what some of the realities are on taxes, because we hear a lot of things. We've been around since 2001, and together with the Child and Family Policy Center, Sheila's here from the Child and Family Policy Center, we worked on a lot of tax issues over those 17, 18 years with CFPC, and trying to help people better understand the impacts of what our tax policies are on people and what they are on our ability to provide quality public services. What are some of those trends, and what are the things we've seen? What are the things that are coming? So in 2019, you start out a legislative session. Of course, we're well into this one, but you start out the year, and it's like having a bunch of ships on the river. You don't know what's on them, especially these days when things are not terribly transparent as to what's going on. There's a lot of guessing involved, and prepare for a lot of things. So we have to, find out which ships are coming in. And it starts out with knowing what the revenue situation is. The revenues for this year are such that we don't see a need for, apparently there's no, mid-year cuts as we have seen in recent years. But for the coming year, as you can see, REC is projecting, about 1.5% increase. So that's defining a lot of what can happen at, in the budget process going on. But this is the key point to remember, is that this isn't something that just happens. We're not going to have 1.5% increase next year just because that's what the economy lets us do. A lot of it is determined on the public policies that are set to determine what revenues are going to come in. And the trends that we have on that are to drive that down, as we will see. So on the budget for this year that the governor submitted, as you can see, over half of it is for education, about a quarter of it for health and human services. A lot of other things are in here, but notice this one slice, 6% is property tax replacement. It's a big piece of our budget these days. Again, it's you're having to take money from the general fund to pay for tax cuts. This is where the revenues come from. Personal income tax is over half, a little over half. Sales and use tax is a big piece. Corporate income taxes are only 7% of the budget. So 7% of the budget, okay, it doesn't seem like much. Well, if you didn't have that corporate income tax that you're getting now, think how much worse things would be. Should it be larger? That's for the state of Iowa to decide, but that's where it is right now.
Now, is that net of credits or are the credits on the other side?
That's what the general fund is going to get in, so that would be net.
Net,
So we go back to those ships, and what are some of the trends that we have seen on taxes over the last several years? When we started the Iowa Policy Project in 2001, it was not long after the income tax cuts had gone into effect in the late 90s, which had been a 10% across the board cut in income tax rates. So that shrunk the pie. It also was heavily weighted toward the wealthy. Then we had sales tax increases, and those actually go back further. When I was a young reporter at the Iowa State House in 1983, that's when Governor Branstad had just come into office, and the first thing that he did was to propose a sales tax increase. That increase, which was approved by the legislature that year, moved our sales tax from 3% to 4%. Of course, now it's 6% and in some places 7%. Over those years, that's been a place where we've increased taxes. Property tax cuts that came in 2013. Income tax, again, we had income tax cuts in the last session that are starting to take effect and will be phased in. There's some elements to that legislation that we're going to cover here today very quickly. And then there's more tax cuts coming. Now, the common theme here is we're not finding things that are going to raise revenues. They're going to raise our ability to actually do more or better on the services that we provide now. We're seeing things to shrink our budget, and this is one of the things that's on the table right now. We're talking about, it may or may not happen this year, but in a couple of years it would be almost $90 million to repeal the state inheritance tax. We'll have new limitations on local revenues. There's legislation moving on that right now, and one of the handouts that I had over on the table, many of you probably have, looks at some of the implications of that. One is, by the way, that it's not that things get into some kind of a crisis mode, that we have to deal with this tax or that tax. Well, the facts about property taxes are that as a percent of income in our state, they have steadily gone down. And for cities and counties, they have stayed relatively stable for several years, which is in that, there's a graph in that piece. That one right there. More corporate income tax cuts. When the income tax bill passed last year, one of the messages that I kept hearing was, we're doing this stuff on income tax right now, personal income tax, and we'll get to corporate income tax next.
Yeah, right.
And that we'll reform our corporate tax credits as part of that whole system. What you're going to see is a lot of this is already in place. So there's the promises about tax credits. So all these things affect what is on the pie, and there's a study bill that just came out last week in the Senate that has some kind of an expansion of the research activities credit, an expansion of the student tuition organization tax credit, and there are many more things. It's a quite intricate bill. There's no fiscal note available yet. There are already people signing on board without even having that information about what are the impacts going to be. Maybe some of the folks in this room are signing because you like one thing in there. Got to look at these things comprehensively and see what the impacts overall are going to be on state revenues and our ability to do the things that you want to see. So the inheritance tax repeal, again, I guess you're conflicting things as to whether this might move this year. Whether it does or not, there's a lot of talk out there, a lot of myths about what the inheritance tax is. What you might want to realize is that this is a $90 million cost of doing this, and not one single surviving child, grandchild, parent, grandparent would see any benefit to the repeal of this. Why? Because our inheritance tax already exempts those folks. It exempts your lineal descendants and ascendants. And the Department of Revenue is estimating that about a third, so based on a sample that they looked at, about a third, $30 million, would go to non-residents. So you want to take $90 million out of your revenue pie, that's about 2% supplemental state aid. That's one way to do it. It also violates this principle that one of the ones that we look at. We look at about 7 different tax principles, but 2 key principles we look at when we analyze tax policy are equity and revenue adequacy. So what is it doing to your revenues, but also how are we apportioning the change in our taxes, and how does it affect the overall structure of equity in our tax system? What this violates is one that we see a lot of times. You single out one tax that has a specific impact on people because of they might have that kind of income. So rather than looking at the question of ability to pay and whether people who are getting like amounts or similar amounts of income are paying about the same in taxes, we're saying, no, you know, it came from here, so we're going to give them a break. And we're going to make people who are working for the same amount of money pay more. So when we look at budgeting processes, this, we would argue, is the way you should look at it, is that your priorities determine and frame what your budget's going to be. Certainly you have to be aware of how much money you have to spend, that's part of the whole thing, but your priorities are going to frame that budget, first and foremost. So you have your revenue needs, and you see what kind of revenues you're going to have. And this is, in state government at least, you have to balance your budget, right, Mary? So these are going to be roughly the same size, and that's not perfect, but you get the idea. What happens instead is we see the Grover Norquist approach, which is happening here in Iowa, steadily over decades, as shown by those ships with the various cuts we've seen in recent years. So you have your tax revenue, that's circle's the same size as it was last time, except first thing you do is you cut it. You make it smaller, which means inevitably your budget's going to be smaller because you can't spend more than that. Their priorities there start with the concept of how little can we do. That is Iowa 2019. Our budget process is upside down. So it might not surprise you to know that so is our tax system. So when we look at that question of equity, we have a system that taxes as a share of their income the richest people pay significantly less as a share of their income than people at the lowest end of the scale. And these are the most recent numbers, and it's about, you can see that for the top 5%, it's down in this range of, you round it, about 8%. It's about 10% and above for everybody else. And when you get down to the lowest end, you're above 12%. On average, that's what you pay in state and local taxes.
And this includes sales tax.
It does include sales tax. And the reason we look at state and local taxes is because the state pretty much governs what the locals can do.
Sure.
These are very small numbers, so they just kind of break it down. What you would see if I put that into a graph form, which I probably should have done for this, is that the reason that this scale looks the way it does is because we have a regressive tax system, as do most states. And there are some, believe me, that are even worse than ours, but we don't want to We don't want to let too many people know that because they might take us that direction as well. We don't want to be like the state of Washington. We don't want to be like states that don't have an income tax. That's where you see the most regressive tax systems. It's just the systems that tax low-income people very heavily as a share of income compared to high income.
So states like South Dakota and Florida
Yes.
don't have state income
Right.
tax. And you're saying they get it
They're-
in some other rather regressive ways.
Right. Texas, Nevada. So there are, when we talk about tax reform, getting back to that pinpoint, you know, what would we start out, if we were starting a new tax system today, starting from scratch, would you start out as a principle of your tax system that you're going to tax low-income people at a higher rate than you're going to tax high-income people? That's one way to look at where we are now. So are we going to make it better? And it was not improved by the so-called, well, I won't even use the term because it extends the use of it. That's one of the things in framing issues. You don't want to repeat the bogus language. Suffice to say, the middle class did not do very well with the 2018 tax bill that passed. And this is what it looked. These are not our numbers, by the way. These are the official numbers from the state. And while they are kind of small on there, I'm going to highlight a couple of areas. So if you're a middle-income person in Iowa, you're in this range. You're actually in the higher end of this range of $30,000 to $60,000 adjusted gross income. Your median income in Iowa is like $57,000, $58,000. A quarter of the taxpayers in Iowa are in that range, and their share of the total tax cut was about 0.3%. Or no, excuse me, that's the percent of their income. So it wasn't very big.
10%.
Okay. The percent of the total tax cut was 10%. Now, if you look at the people making between or above $250,000 a year, you're looking at 2.5% of taxpayers, and they're getting about 46% together, or almost half of the total tax cut is going to people at those ranges. But here's, I think, an interesting point about those numbers as well. You're somebody making $1 million or more, and you say you're going to get about $25,000 more in your tax cut. You really need it? What are you going to do with it? You can't even buy, you certainly can't buy the kind of car you want, so you're not going to add to your car fleet with it. You know, I think what we see a lot of times with the tax issues is that taxes generally, people have in their minds that it's the same. And so you talk about taxes, you're thinking about your federal taxes. State taxes really aren't that much. Together, we put together enough to do a lot of things if we do our tax system right. But you're paying a lot more in federal tax than you are in state tax. But I think in people's minds, they put it all together, and they don't realize that the numbers are so small. The average tax cut in people in this range was $121. Now, also as part of that bill, there was the issue of the corporate income tax cuts. A couple things we want to cover here are that when we hear about business taxes, we always hear we have to cut them to be competitive. We are already exceedingly competitive in Iowa. The fastest growing area of spending that we have in our state is in business tax credits. And we never even think about, seriously, about closing corporate tax loopholes. These are things that are not necessarily something, you don't put a law in the books to create a loophole necessarily. A loophole, when we talk about it here, is that we have seams in our tax code that just over time may develop because businesses change, the economy changes. There are things that accountants and lawyers find that help their companies, we don't plug those holes, but we keep losing money through it, and it's to the tune of about $60 to $100 million a year. The last time we had revenue estimates from the Department of Revenue, which was probably about 10 years ago. This is what the tax bill did in terms of revenue. It did and is doing and will do in terms of overall revenue. So you're going to have, in this current year, it's costing us only about $100 million only. It's going to be almost, it's $260 million for the budget year that's being, for the budget being built now, and it just keeps going up. We're in 2024, it's projected to be $642 million. Now what we talked before about the income tax bill and people thinking of it as a personal income tax, there were corporate income tax cuts already built in to this bill. So that when they're saying we're going to do individual income tax this year, we'll do the corporate income tax stuff next year, they actually built some in. And so what's coming next? I mean, before they even get something passed that's going to affect new corporate income tax cuts, there's some that are already set to happen. This is how it changed in the current, in the new bill. So we went from 6%, depending on the income of a corporation, 6% to 12%. Everybody's all worried about that big 12% rate, but it only affected, some businesses. It didn't affect all of them. Those rates are going to change from 5.5% down to below 10%. And this is going to be the impact for those changes. So the first 2 years, there's really not an impact because we're coupling with the federal tax law on for businesses, so that there actually is a bump for the first couple of years. But that goes away. And soon it gets overshadowed. I apologize for the colors. It's kind of, it looked different on my screen. I think we have these walls change things a little bit. But you're talking about a loss of over $40 million from 2021 to 2024. Over $40 million a year is going to be cut from corporate taxes already before any other corporate income tax cuts happen, and no reforms yet of tax credits. In addition, the property tax cuts, which were not for individuals, that's one of the reasons that we're talking about it now, again, in the legislature, because residences weren't helped by that. It was really for commercial and industrial property. Kind of downplayed that when it was going through. We just passed the biggest tax cut in Iowa history. We've heard that twice now in the last few years, but that's what Governor Branstad trumpeted as the property tax bill. Biggest tax cut in Iowa history, implying to a lot of people, I would argue, that they thought they were going to be getting property tax cuts. They didn't get those property tax cuts, so now they want them. But what happened was we got this bill, which gave us a $3 billion price tag over 10 years. So for the current year, FY19, we're already up at a cost of $321,000 million from the general fund to pay for those property tax cuts. The new budget, $330 million, and it keeps going up. Over $300 million. So we don't know, if those stay in place, that's a $300 million hit to revenues every year. Again, do the math yourself for the services that you care about, how that $300 million could be spent. But the one I always go back to is supplemental state aid. 1% supplemental state aid is between $40 and $43 million a year. So we keep being told that there's not money to do this or that. There's money available if we want to capture it for our services. So we have the tax cuts that have been made, tax credits that are the fastest growing part of our spending. and tax loopholes that are never addressed. This is why we say that Iowa business taxes are already competitive. And this analysis is from, I'm going to give you stuff from 2 different consultants. They're both very large consulting firms, accounting firms that businesses rely on. These are not big liberal organizations or something. The first one is from Ernst & Young, and they show that in 2016 we ranked 29th as a share of our gross state product, businesses, state and local business taxes. So again, these are things that are governed by state policy. 2016, we were at 29th. These little red triangles at the bottom kind of show you where surrounding states are. So we're actually in the middle to low compared to surrounding states. We all hear about how uncompetitive we are. This is what it looked like for a year later. We were 19th, but the thing to look at here is that our percentage didn't change that much of what you were actually paying. Which is also, when you look at this graph, you can see why that is. You can move up and down these rankings a lot and not be much different from a lot of states. Everybody's in a pack. This next measure is by Anderson Economic Group, and they did it as a share of profit, pre-tax operating surplus. In this one, we went from 28th in 2015 to the next year 38th. But again, we didn't change that much. There wasn't really a big change in how much people were paying. It's just that we're already very competitive. This is not an issue. Business tax credits, you can see we're up in the $300 million. It becomes kind of a magic number, doesn't it? Like everything costs $300 million anymore. Business tax credits, and this is not to say, I mean, there may be some of those that make perfect sense. Just like any tax credits. There's tax credits that a lot of people in this room would probably agree are a good public policy thing. Some of them have more accountability than others. Some of them can have a more demonstrated public benefit than others. But for business tax credits, it's $300 million a year. And the biggest one is the favorite one we like to talk about, the research activities credit, just because it's crying out so much for reform. Not just in our view, but by, remember there was a special tax credit review panel that met in the wake of the film credit scandal. And they would have actually been harder on the research credit than we have recommended. But in a nutshell, the cost of the research credit is now disclosed in a report that comes out about February 15th every year. There's a law on the books. Senator Bolcom was really involved in getting passed. And that report gives some good information about the credit. It shows how many credits there are, individual and corporate. It shows how much of them are refunds. So this is a refundable credit. If you have more tax credits available than you owe in taxes, you get a check for the balance. With some things that can make sense. Actually, with the research activities credit, arguably it can make sense. What we understand from why it was developed the way it was, and both Sheila's and my organizations were founded by former legislators who were here when it happened, so that we know some of the origins of some of these things. If you're a small entrepreneur, you want to help a small entrepreneur get going with the research credit. That's why this was developed. In the first few years, they're probably not going to make any money. They're not going to owe any taxes. So if you want to use a tax credit to help them out, to make sure they get the benefit of that credit, you make it refundable. What's happened is something totally different from that over these years. And this came in the 80s. And to the point where these, tens of millions of dollars are going out every year as checks, not as tax credits. The dark part of those bars are the refunds. The lighter area on those bars represents the amount of a corporate research credit that was used to actually erase taxes. It's the minority of the credit. Most of the credit is used as just simply a subsidy program for companies. They also happen to be very large companies, mostly. These are claims, not refunds, but they show from the latest tax credit report from Department of Revenue, Rockwell Collins is the biggest one. They had almost $14 million in claims in 2018. Between Deere and John Deere Construction, you have about $7 million. DuPont and Monsanto are also big players. Monsanto was actually not the fifth this year, but these 5 companies over the 9 years we have reports for are the ones who traditionally are up there. And it's almost always Rockwell Collins first. I think it might have been 1 year when Deere was second, or Deere was first. So now that study bill that I mentioned, there is a provision in there to expand who is eligible for that credit. And I noted the DuPont companies are one of the supporters of the legislation. I have no idea if that's the reason for it, but like I said, it's a very multifaceted bill, but there's no fiscal note yet. So we don't know what the impact of that expansion is going to be. That's something we're really watching for. So I mentioned the review panel and loopholes. So there's something called combined reporting, which is the way you can plug those loopholes. And one of the things we often hear on that is that you don't want to do something that's going to force a company to leave. Well, I'm not an economist and I'm not a tax lawyer and all that, but I do know enough about taxes to know that our corporate taxes are not set up in a way that would encourage that. The reason is that we have what's called a single factor formula, and we also, which means that the only thing that your corporate taxes apply to are the amount of, are a portion, they're a portion to your sales within the state of Iowa. Okay? And it has nothing to do with your manufacturing plants. So so those are, two elements that are often ignored on this, but the biggest one I would say is one of the things I hear from legislators, often from areas where Deere is strong. Well, Deere says they'll leave. We pass combined reporting, Deere says we'll leave. Where's Deere headquartered? Moline,
Moline.
Illinois. It's a combined reporting state. Case closed. But we would gain $60 to $100 million a year from that if we close that. I think I am going to skip the rest of this so we can get to any questions that people have. Getting close. I'll try and
Questions that you
answer
have?
what I can.
Mike, can you talk about the tax credits that are good, child care tax credits, some of the things?
Yeah,
the historic
well,
credits?
the first one we always talk about is the earned income tax credit. And that, other than the research activities credit, that's the second largest tax credit program we have. So it's a different kind of thing. But with the research activities credit, we have no evidence that it's creating any significant amount of new research in the state, supporting new jobs. Does it support jobs? I'm sure it does. The question is, if you take that credit away, do those jobs leave?
Yeah.
It's not like they can go to the next state, or like these companies would have some place that are going to find the same deal. The research activities credit in Iowa is incredibly generous. There may be one or two other states that have anything close to it. So you have a research operation here. What's your real incentive to leave? Now, if you don't want to give up the money, okay, but maybe you should be paying a little bit more. The earned income tax credit, on the other hand, is demonstrated to do things that help not only families to get by, but also is demonstrated to actually churn over in our economy. Because low-income families who benefit from things like the earned income tax credit, by definition, they don't have a lot of money. And they spend it in the local economy. So not only are they helped, but the local economy is helped. And then you mentioned that, maybe the child independent care credit. Now, that's part of that study bill. There's an expansion of that in there. Again, I really want to see the fiscal note. We typically don't register for or against bills. We don't do any very much direct lobbying just because of the nature of our organization. But that's one of the things I want to look at. I want to see, what kind of a deal is that going to be? And the other thing, is it worth what you're going to give up on some other things? And one other thing I'd recommend when we get that fiscal note is when we look at that line by line to see the various aspects of that bill, is there going to be a single one of those changes that raises revenue? All we ever talk about is cutting revenue. It's Grover Norquist. He ought to be our governor.
He is our governor.
I mean, that's, I'm being a little facetious there, but that is the policy that we're following.
My question is, are there any research credits for universities so that in our state we would support our universities doing research as opposed to?
Well, these are corporate credits, so it's.
So there's no way really to, think about how we would
I'm not sure how that could happen. I mean, if we want to support research at our universities, we could do that. It'd be interesting to say, that'd be an interesting proposal. Everything we're spending on the research activities credit, let's put it into Iowa State, UNI.
Well, my concern is when companies do all the research, they're biased on public universities.
That is an excellent point, because we become, with the research activities credit, you're saying, I'll repeat it if you couldn't hear it, is that saying, we're buying that, right? But the companies are getting all the benefit, effectively.
Right, well, on the research that they do, I think they have a conflict.
Right, so the companies own the research, so we're subsidizing the research that they own. We don't know what that research goes for. We have no evidence that it is we just don't have any evidence as to what we're getting for our money. But we are effectively investors in those companies with no stake we're getting back.
Randy, you have a question?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike, for coming today. This is
Yeah.
helpful. We had a legislative forum on Saturday, and so the issue of the 2% cap on property tax came up, and quite a spirited discussion about it. This is Senator John Forbes, and our county supervisor and mayor. I think the mayor made it really clear with the 2%. He said, we're growing at 4 to 5%. He says, you stick me at 2%. He says, I can't hire police. I can't do the infrastructure I need.
Right.
I can't do anything. It's taking the Norfolk Growquest to the county and the city, it seems. Can you tell me the 2% cap, how will that affect counties and school districts?
It shouldn't affect school districts. It would affect, my understanding is it would affect counties pretty much the same way as it affects cities. Schools, what it'll affect is the mix of funding that they get through the school formula now. So if you do something that restricts property taxes, presumably there would be some more state cost. I mean, because you're going to still get this, you have your state cost per pupil that is governing, a mix of property tax and state aid. So that doesn't bring that down. Now, what it does do is school funding is so complex that, I probably shouldn't go down that path.
Well, the thing on school funding, I was a school superintendent in Iowa for 17 years. The thing on school funding is if your enrollment stays the same or goes down, you will get zero new money.
Right.
And if health insurance and gasoline costs and electricity costs go up 2, 3, 4%, you just went in the hole, and that's when you start saying, oh, I've got to reduce
Yes.
teachers. I've got to reduce, I've got to
Absolutely,
cut costs. and
absolutely.
How am I gonna do that? I'm gonna reduce my teaching staff.
So if you ask people who are even marginally engaged with what goes on at the legislature, they would tell you that schools got a 2% increase this year, right?
They got a 2.06,
But that's an average.
but it depends on where you're at.
Depends on where you're at. So if you have declining enrollment,
You're-
yeah, you're in.
75% of our districts are declining.
Yeah.
Yep.
Declining enrollment, yeah.
Oh, a while back, quite a while back, I was in a state investigator for civil rights. And I was looking into a company that I knew got a grant. And one of the provisions of the grant was that they had to hire so many people at wages of $8.25 or greater. So I went after the statistics or the actual thing, and basically got stonewalled by our own departments. So I guess my question is, when they grant these corporations money, what kind of oversight do we have to make sure they use it for what they say they do?
I can't speak to the particular oversight, but what's interesting about that question is that is, you know, what you're saying is that there should be some wage standards for people who are hired into a program,
Yeah.
an economic development program. Not all of these programs have that. I think there probably is more interest in it now than maybe there was 10, 15 years ago, but still not all the programs have that. And the question is it enough anyway? You know, there's a lot of objection to prevailing wage laws around here these days. But that's what you really need.
Well, frankly, I think. they
Do
put
things
the
to
money
raise
in-
wages. So that's a case where you can use public policy to, where you are making an investment in some kind of a project, to make sure you're getting something back from it. That you're getting, you know, infrastructure built that will benefit a community, that you're getting jobs that pay a certain amount. Those kinds of provisions need to be part of economic development.
Likewise, does the state auditor examine the research expenditures like at Rockwell Collins to make sure they qualify for the credit?
I have seen no evidence that previous state auditors have done this. I'm aware that the current state auditor is aware of the issue.
Okay.
But I don't know
Okay.
specifically what he may or may not be doing on it. The Department of Revenue presumably is doing some oversight to make sure that they are meeting the standards that are there, but we just don't get any public reports on it. We don't know what we're getting for our money on
I
that.
mean, cost accounting is quite creative at times.
We used to not even know the names of the companies that received the tax credits either. I mean, they used to not, you know, we could guess who they were. I remember sitting in a subcommittee many years ago, and Senator Vulcan just introduced a bill just so we could see who would come to the subcommittee. It eliminated the tax credits because you wanted to see the subcommittee, so you know they had to go around the room and say, hi, I'm so-and-so from Pioneers, and so on, so you knew.
And the reason-
I bet you they probably get a tax credit.
So that bill passed in 2009. Interestingly, about, you know, half a year before the film credit scandal broke, we got the bill, the legislation passed that assured that we would get that state report or that annual report every year. And the first full year for that report was for 2010. So from 2010 on, we know who, at least in terms of the claims, not necessarily the refunds, we can see what the claims were for anybody over $250,000.
No.
Excuse me, is this fine? Yeah. So that's your, that's what we get.
One last question?
So has there been any bipartisan discussion about these tax loopholes and where we should go in the future? Doesn't sound like there's much of an appetite for it.
I haven't seen it on loopholes, but again, we kind of distinguish the credits from loopholes. The credits were actually established by, the legislature passed them, that you could, now has it changed? Yes. There was some discussion in House Appropriations, I want to say it was 2 years ago, but they were looking at something that would end refundability for all tax credits. So it would have treated the earned income tax credit the same as the research activities credit. And the idea that you would deny, $200 refund to a low-income family to deal with the issue of millions of dollars going to a company that's making hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, doesn't seem like a very realistic or appropriate trade-off.
All right, let's thank Mike. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here at Oral Mondays. I have no idea what the subject is next week, so stay tuned.
There.